There comes a moment when you realize you are the only one in your family who ever asked, why? Not, why did this happen to me? That question is easy, almost reflexive. The harder question is, why does this keep happening, generation after generation, in different bodies, different names, the same wound wearing different clothes? You start noticing the shape of it in your grandmother's silence, in your father's temper, in the way your mother apologized for things that weren't her fault. And somewhere in that noticing, something in you stood up. That standing up is what this is about. Carl Jung spent his career studying what gets passed down in families without anyone ever agreeing to pass it down. Rather than property or eye color, he saw patterns getting passed down. Ways of surviving pain that calcify into ways of causing it. He watched patients arrive in his office, carrying grief that wasn't fully their own. Carrying rage that had been rehearsed by someone else first, carrying fear shaped decades before they were born. He didn't have the language we have now for generational trauma, but he saw it. He called the forces operating beneath a person's conscious awareness the unconscious, and he understood that families don't just pass down surnames and furniture, they pass down unlived lives. If you have ever looked at your own reactions in a moment of stress and thought, that wasn't me, that was someone else speaking through me, you already know what this script is about. If you have ever caught yourself mid-sentence, mid-anger, mid-shutdown, and recognized your mother's voice, your father's posture, a grandparent you never even met, you already know. Today I want to walk you through what it actually means to be a cycle breaker. Not the inspirational poster version, the real one, the one that costs something, that isolates you before it frees you, that Jung understood better than almost anyone who came before or after him. Because here's what nobody tells you when they hand you that phrase, cycle breaker, like it's a badge you get to wear. They don't tell you about the loneliness of being the first. They don't tell you about the grief that comes before the freedom. They don't tell you that the people who raised you, who shaped the pattern you're now trying to interrupt, may never understand what you're doing, may even fight you on it. Jung would have called this the price of consciousness. You're not just healing yourself, you're metabolizing something an entire lineage couldn't digest, and doing it mostly alone. Every family carries something in its bones. Some carry silence, generations of people who learned that speaking meant danger, so they simply stopped. Some carry rage, handed down like an heirloom nobody wanted but everybody inherited anyway. Some carry a particular flavor of fear, a hypervigilance that gets mistaken for personality, a need to control that gets mistaken for competence. Jung watched this pattern show up over and over in his clinical work, though he wouldn't have used that clinical framing himself. He talked instead about complexes, autonomous clusters of emotion and memory that behave almost like a person living inside a person, activated by triggers the conscious mind never chose. What he discovered was unsettling in its implications. A complex formed in one generation doesn't stay contained to that generation. It gets absorbed by the children who grow up inside its orbit, who learn, without ever being taught in words, that this is simply how things are, how people are, how love behaves. The child doesn't inherit the original wound. The child inherits the adaptation to the wound and mistakes that adaptation for identity. Picture a woman who grew up with a mother who went cold whenever conflict arose. There was no screaming, no violence, just an absence, a door closing behind the eyes. The daughter learned, long before she had language for it, that conflict meant abandonment, that her needs were a kind of danger to the people she loved. She grew into an adult who apologized for existing, who shrank herself in rooms, who mistook her own hypervigilant kindness for a personality trait rather than what it actually was, a survival strategy she built at 4 years old and never got to put down. That's the shape of an unbroken cycle. It doesn't look like violence most of the time. It looks like inheritance disguised as normal life. It looks like a family where everyone agrees, without ever saying it out loud, on which subjects are too dangerous to touch, which feelings are permitted, which ones require apology. Jung understood that the unconscious doesn't announce itself. It runs quietly in the background, dictating reactions, relationships, the entire emotional weather of a household, while everyone inside it believes they're simply making free choices. Think about the man who grew up in a house where anger was the only emotion allowed full expression. Sadness got mocked out of him. Fear got called weakness. So he learned, the way children learn things without ever being told directly, that anger was the one door left open, and everything else that needed a way out eventually found its way through that same door instead. He became a man known for his temper, and everyone around him, including himself, treated that temper as simply who he was, a fixed trait, an unfortunate inheritance from a difficult father, something you either tolerated or avoided. What almost no one around him understood, including him, was that underneath the anger was decades of grief and fear that had never once been given anywhere else to go. This is the part of inherited patterns that tends to get missed. What we call personality is often, underneath, a set of emotional escape routes carved so early and so repeatedly that they stopped feeling like roots at all and started feeling like character. The overly independent sibling who can't ask for help isn't simply strong-willed. The chronically anxious daughter who apologizes reflexively isn't simply sensitive. These are adaptations, worn smooth by repetition, mistaken by everyone, including the person living inside them, for something innate rather than something built. What I'm going to walk you through today is what actually happens when someone becomes the person who interrupts that pattern. What causes it, what it costs, what it demands of you psychologically, spiritually, relationally, and what waits on the other side of it. Not a fantasy of total healing, but something more honest and, I think, more valuable. The ability to live a life that is actually yours, built from choices instead of inherited reflexes. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that cycle breakers carry, and it rarely gets named correctly. It isn't the exhaustion of hard work. It's the exhaustion of doing something no one taught you how to do, with no map, while the people closest to you sometimes actively resist the change because your healing threatens the unspoken rules that held the family together. You didn't choose to become the exception. Something in you simply refused to keep carrying what was never yours to carry in the first place. Most cycle breakers don't experience a single dramatic moment of realization. It builds slowly, in increments too small to notice individually. A therapy session that cracks something open. A friend's offhand comment that lands like an accusation because it's true. A moment holding your own child, or imagining holding a future child, and feeling a visceral refusal rise up in your chest. Not like that, never like that, not to them. Jung observed something about these moments that still holds. He noticed that psychological change rarely announces itself with fanfare. It arrives quietly, through what he called compensation, the psyche correcting an imbalance the conscious mind has been too afraid to name directly. The compensation shows up as dreams that won't leave you alone, as a body that starts refusing to perform the old roles, chronic tension, panic that arrives without an obvious trigger, a physical revolt against dynamics you've tolerated for years, as a sudden, disproportionate reaction to something small, a reaction that in hindsight was never really about the small thing at all. Jung would have said the unconscious was trying to get your attention, that it had been trying for years, and finally found a channel loud enough to break through. Consider a man in his early 30s who prided himself on never losing his temper until his daughter turned 4 and started testing boundaries the way 4-year-olds do. He noticed something rising in him during those moments that frightened him more than anything his daughter actually did. A voice, an impulse, a flash of something that felt inherited rather than chosen. He recognized it because he'd been on the receiving end of it as a child. That recognition became the crack that let everything else in. He hadn't actually become his father in that moment, but he'd come close enough that the almost was enough to wake him up. This is usually how it starts, less with clarity than with fear, the fear of becoming the very thing you swore you'd never become. Jung called the parts of ourselves we've rejected and pushed into darkness the shadow. And one of the cruelest tricks the shadow plays is this. The things we most fiercely deny in ourselves are often exactly the things we're most at risk of repeating, precisely because denial keeps them unconscious, and what stays unconscious keeps its grip. The child who swears she'll never be as critical as her mother often becomes exactingly critical of herself instead, turning the inherited voice inward rather than outward, calling it high standards, calling it self-discipline, never recognizing it as the same pattern wearing a mask. The son who swears he'll never be as absent as his father sometimes becomes obsessively present in ways that suffocate rather than nurture, overcorrecting so hard he creates a new wound shaped exactly like the old one, just inverted. Cycle breaking rarely means simply doing the opposite of what was done to you. It means understanding the mechanism well enough that you stop being ruled by it entirely, in either direction. This is where a lot of well-intentioned healing work actually fails. People notice the pattern, decide consciously to reject it, and assume that conscious rejection is the same thing as transformation. It isn't. Jung was clear about this, even if he phrased it differently than we would today. What we resist unconsciously, we tend to enact unconsciously, no matter how firmly we've decided on the surface that we want something different. Real change requires going underneath the decision, into the actual architecture of the pattern, where it lives in the body, what it protects, what it was originally trying to survive. Conventional approaches to this often stop at the level of behavior, and that's precisely why they tend to fail over time. A person reads that their parents were emotionally unavailable, decides consciously to be more emotionally available with their own children, and works hard at it, praising more, listening more, saying the words their own parents never said. And it helps, for a while. But underneath the effortful behavior, the old fear is often still running the show, unexamined, waiting for a moment of exhaustion or crisis to reassert itself. Behavioral change without the deeper excavation tends to hold only as long as the person has the energy to consciously override the old programming, and nobody has that kind of energy indefinitely. This is why willpower alone rarely breaks a generational pattern permanently. Willpower is a conscious resource, and it depletes. The unconscious pattern, by contrast, doesn't get tired. It waits. It resurfaces exactly when you're least equipped to catch it, during a fight with your partner at the end of an exhausting week, during a moment of panic with a sick child at 2 in the morning, during any circumstance that strips away the conscious effort and leaves only reflex. This is often the moment people feel the most shame, the moment they say to themselves, "I thought I was past this." You are not past it in the sense of having eliminated it. You are in relationship with it, which is a very different, far more sustainable kind of progress. The deeper work Jung pointed toward involves something more uncomfortable than behavioral adjustment. It involves actually meeting the original fear underneath the pattern, in whatever form it takes, sitting with the terror of abandonment that made you controlling, or the humiliation that made you defensive, or the powerlessness that made you need to dominate every room you walk into. This isn't comfortable work, and it rarely happens quickly. But it's the only version of change that tends to survive contact with real stress, because it addresses the root rather than managing the branches. That's the part almost nobody talks about. The pattern you're trying to break wasn't random cruelty. It was, almost always, an adaptation to something unbearable. Your grandmother's coldness wasn't a personality flaw dropped from nowhere. It was very likely armor she built because warmth had once been dangerous, because someone punished her softness, because she learned early that feeling too much got you hurt, or abandoned, or worse. Your father's temper wasn't proof he didn't love you. It was very possibly the only language of intensity he'd ever been shown, inherited from a father who showed him the same, going back further than either of them could trace. None of that erases harm. Understanding where a pattern came from doesn't mean excusing what it did to you. And cycle breaking isn't about performing forgiveness you don't actually feel. But there's something important that happens when you can hold both truths at once. That you were genuinely hurt, and that the person who hurt you was also at some point someone small who got hurt first. Jung believed that real transformation required exactly this kind of double vision. The refusal to look away from harm, paired with the refusal to reduce a whole human being to the worst thing that moved through them. There's a version of this story that plays out across 3 generations, and once you start looking for it, you see it almost everywhere. A grandfather raised in scarcity and violence learns that control is survival, that softness gets you killed or starved or left behind. He raises a son under that same iron control, meaning to protect him, and the son grows into a man who either becomes just as controlling, terrified of the chaos his father was terrified of, or swings hard in the opposite direction, permissive to the point of abandonment, having decided control itself was the enemy, rather than examining what it was actually protecting against. Either way, the grandchild inherits an imbalance, too much structure, or not nearly enough, built from a fear that had nothing to do with them, born in a scarcity they never lived through, in a decade they never saw. This is what Jung meant when he talked about complexes operating with a kind of autonomy, almost as if they had their own will separate from the person carrying them. The fear doesn't ask permission before it activates. It doesn't check whether the actual threat is present. It simply fires, the way it's always fired, because that's the groove it wore into the nervous system generations before you arrive to inherit it. You can be a calm, self-aware adult, fully capable of reason, and still find your hands shaking with a rage or a panic that belongs, more accurately, to someone else's history than your own present moment. Recognizing this doesn't happen all at once. It usually happens through repetition, the same reaction, noticed again and again, until a pattern becomes undeniable even to a mind that spent years finding reasons to explain it away as circumstance. Maybe it's the 5th time you've ended a relationship the exact same way, for reasons that sound different every time but somehow land in the identical place. Maybe it's the 3rd job where you found yourself recreating the same dynamic with an authority figure that you spent your childhood navigating with a parent. The unconscious repeats what it hasn't yet been allowed to understand, and it will keep repeating it, patiently, for as long as it takes to finally get your attention. What makes this especially disorienting is that the pattern often feels, from the inside, like free choice every single time. Nobody experiences their reaction as a rerun. It feels immediate, justified, entirely about the present situation. This is part of what makes inherited patterns so difficult to interrupt. They don't announce themselves as inherited. They arrive dressed as instinct, as personality, as simply how you are, and unwinding that disguise is some of the hardest psychological work a person can do. Picture a woman who keeps choosing partners who are, in her words, emotionally unavailable, distant, hard to read, generous with everything except the specific kind of steady reassurance she craves most. She's aware of the pattern. She's read about it, talked about it in therapy, promised herself after the last one that this time would be different. And yet, somehow, the next relationship follows the same shape, dressed up in different details. What's actually happening beneath her awareness is more specific than bad luck. Her nervous system learned, very early, that love was something you had to work to earn from someone withholding, and a small, unconscious part of her still associates that particular tension, the reaching, the almost, the not quite, with what love is supposed to feel like. Ease, by contrast, can feel suspicious, even boring, because it doesn't match the template. This is one of the more painful discoveries cycle breakers eventually make. Sometimes the thing keeping the pattern alive isn't only what was done to you, but what your own psyche came to associate with love, safety, or worth as a result of it. Jung would have said the unconscious doesn't distinguish between healthy and familiar. It simply gravitates toward what it already knows, because the known, however painful, feels safer than the unknown, however healthy. Breaking this particular thread requires more than recognizing the pattern intellectually. It requires slowly, deliberately, teaching your own nervous system that ease is not the same thing as danger, a retraining that happens through repeated experience far more than through insight alone. The good news, if there is a clean way to call it that, is that this retraining is genuinely possible. The nervous system that learned tension equals love can also learn, given enough repeated evidence, that steadiness equals love too. It simply takes longer than anyone wants it to, and it rarely happens through willpower alone. It happens through choosing the unfamiliar, uncomfortable option enough times that it eventually stops feeling unfamiliar and starts, slowly, to feel like home instead. I want to pause here because this is usually where things get heavy, and it's worth naming that directly rather than letting the weight build without acknowledgement. If any of this is landing close to something real in your own life, take a breath. You don't have to hold all of it at once. What we're doing here is building a framework, piece by piece, and frameworks exist to make heavy things easier to carry, not to add more weight to what you're already holding. There's a moment that tends to arrive for people doing this work, a moment I think of as the offer, a point where you're handed something that promises to make the whole process faster, gentler, more structured than doing it entirely alone in the dark. That's part of why the guide behind this channel exists. True self-discovery came out of exactly the pattern we've been tracing. The recognition that most people trying to break a cycle are doing it with no map at all, improvising, exhausting themselves reinventing tools that other people have already built. It's built around 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's own way of working with the psyche, designed less as instructions and more as a series of doors, each one opening onto a part of yourself that's been waiting, sometimes for decades, to be asked an honest question. If any part of what you've heard so far feels like it's describing your own inheritance, it might be worth finding your way in. There's a link below. Let's keep going, because the harder part, the part where the pattern actually starts to loosen, is still ahead. The shift, when it finally comes, rarely looks like triumph. It looks like grief. This surprises almost everyone who goes through it, because the culture around healing tends to sell it as an arrival, as though one day you wake up lighter, free, done. What actually happens is closer to a death. You start losing things you didn't expect to lose, relationships that only worked because you played a certain role, a version of yourself that made everyone else comfortable, a story about your family that let you avoid certain unbearable truths for as long as possible. Jung had a word for this stage. He called it the nigredo, borrowing the term from alchemy, the blackening, the dissolving, the necessary decay that has to happen before anything new can take form. Alchemists believed you couldn't create gold from raw material without first breaking that material down to something unrecognizable. Jung saw the exact same principle at work in psychological transformation. You cannot build a self that isn't ruled by inherited patterns without first watching the old self, the adapted, performing, survival-shaped self, come apart. This is the part where cycle breakers often feel like they're getting worse instead of better, and that feeling is not a sign of failure. It's a sign the work is actually working. The armor that used to hold you together starts to feel unbearable rather than protective. The relationships that used to feel like home start to feel like cages. The silence you were taught to keep starts to feel less like safety and more like suffocation. Something in you that used to know exactly how to behave in every family situation suddenly doesn't know anything at all. And that not knowing is disorienting in a way that can feel almost like losing your mind. Think of someone standing at a family dinner, watching a dynamic play out that she's watched 100 times before. The same joke made at someone's expense, the same person going quiet, the same tension dissolving the way it always dissolves, everyone pretending nothing happened. Except this time she can't pretend along with them. Something in her has stopped being able to unsee it. She sits there, fork in hand, feeling like a stranger at a table she's eaten at her entire life. And the loneliness of that moment is sharper than almost anything else in this process. She hasn't left yet. She's just woken up inside a room everyone else is still asleep in. That loneliness deserves to be named honestly, because it's one of the costs nobody warns you about. Breaking a cycle often means becoming psychologically out of step with the very people who are supposed to understand you best. Your growth can look, to them, like rejection. Your boundaries can look like coldness. Your refusal to participate in old patterns, the silence, the deflection, the performance of a harmony that was never real, can look like betrayal to people who built their entire sense of stability on that performance continuing indefinitely. Some families respond to a cycle breaker with curiosity, even relief, as though someone finally gave permission for the truth to exist out loud. Most don't. Most families, consciously or not, resist the member who stops playing along, because that resistance protects the system's fragile equilibrium. Jung understood systems like this intuitively, even though family systems theory hadn't been formally developed yet in his lifetime. He saw that unconscious patterns organize entire groups of people around unspoken rules, and that anyone who breaks a rule threatens the whole architecture, whether or not they mean to. This is why estrangement, or at least significant distance, shows up so often in the stories of people doing this work. It isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, a slow drift, fewer calls, conversations that used to feel effortless now requiring careful navigation around subjects that have become unspeakable. Sometimes it is dramatic, a rupture that happens all at once when a boundary gets stated out loud for the first time, and the system reacts the way systems under threat tend to react, with panic dressed up as anger or guilt dressed up as concern. If this is your story, or some version of it, I want to be honest with you rather than tell you what feels good to hear. This grief is real, and it deserves to be grieved fully rather than bypassed with talk of growth and gratitude before you're ready for either. You are allowed to miss people who hurt you. You are allowed to love your family and still need distance from the patterns they never learned to interrupt. You are allowed to feel like the villain in a story where you know, somewhere underneath the guilt, that you're actually the one telling the truth for the first time. There's a particular kind of shadow work that has to happen here, and it's uncomfortable in a way most healing content skips over. Becoming a cycle breaker isn't only about recognizing what was done to you, it's about recognizing your own complicity in the patterns you've participated in, sometimes for years before you woke up to them. Maybe you were the family member who smoothed things over, who absorbed everyone's discomfort so no one else had to feel it. And maybe some part of that role gave you a sense of importance you weren't ready to give up, even after you understood its cost. Maybe your endless availability to everyone around you wasn't purely selfless. Maybe it was also a way to feel needed because you didn't yet know how to feel valuable on your own terms. That's not a moral failing. It's simply what happens when a child adapts to survive inside a system and carries that adaptation into adulthood without examining it. But real cycle breaking requires you to look at that too, not just the wound, but the ways the wound shaped your own behavior toward others, sometimes in patterns you'd rather not admit to. Jung believed you couldn't integrate the shadow by only looking at what was done to you. You had to look at what you did too, including the parts that served you, including the parts you'd rather keep hidden even from yourself. This is where individuation actually begins, not in the moment you recognize the pattern, but in the harder moment when you take responsibility for your own participation in it, without collapsing into either denial or self-punishment. Jung called individuation the process of becoming whole unto yourself, and he was specific about what that didn't mean. It didn't mean becoming perfect. It didn't mean transcending your flaws entirely. It meant knowing yourself completely enough, the good, the wounded, the complicit, the healing, that you stopped being unconsciously driven by any single part of that whole. There's a death that happens somewhere in the middle of this process, and it's worth naming plainly because euphemism doesn't serve anyone going through it. The identity you built to survive your family has to die for a new one to exist. The peacekeeper has to stop keeping the peace at her own expense. The invisible child has to stop making himself small to avoid becoming a target. The overachiever has to stop performing worth through accomplishment, because somewhere very young, she learned that being loved required earning it. These identities were never you. They were the costume you wore to survive a house that didn't know how to hold the whole of who you actually were. She was 34 years old, sitting in her car outside her parents' house, unable to make herself walk to the front door. Not because anything dramatic had happened. Nothing had happened, which was exactly the problem. She was simply, finally, too tired to perform the role she'd played at every family gathering for 3 decades. The easy one, the one who never caused trouble, the one everyone could count on to keep things light. She sat there for 11 minutes, watching the porch light, feeling something in her chest that she eventually recognized as grief for a version of herself she was about to stop being. Then she went inside anyway, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let a silence sit at the dinner table without rushing to fill it. Nobody said anything, but something in the room shifted, almost imperceptibly, and she drove home that night feeling less like a stranger to herself than she had in years. This kind of moment rarely gets witnessed by anyone else, and it rarely feels like the breakthrough it actually is while it's happening. It feels small, almost anticlimactic, a silence not filled, a joke not made, an old reflex noticed and just barely not obeyed. But these small refusals accumulate into something enormous over time, the same way water accumulates into a canyon. No single moment carves the stone, the pattern of moments does. It's worth being honest, too, about the fear that runs underneath this entire stretch of the process. The fear that if you stop performing the old role, whatever held the family together will finally, visibly, fall apart, and that the falling apart will be your fault. This fear is almost never rational, and it almost never stops the process from happening anyway, because the truth is that the role you were performing was never actually holding anything together. It was postponing a reckoning that was always going to arrive eventually, in one form or another, whether you were the one who triggered it or not. Losing the costume feels like losing yourself at first, because you've worn it for so long you forgot it was ever separate from your skin. This is the part of the process that requires the most patience, because there is no shortcut through it. You cannot think your way out of an identity built from decades of adaptation. You have to live your way out of it, slowly, testing new responses in real situations, tolerating the discomfort of not knowing exactly who you are while the old shape dissolves and a new one hasn't fully formed yet. What emerges on the other side isn't a finished person. It's someone with access to a wider range of responses than the ones the old pattern allowed. The peacekeeper learns she can tolerate conflict without dying from it. The invisible child learns he can take up space without being punished for it. The overachiever learns her worth was never actually conditional, that it was only ever conditional inside a household that made it feel that way. This isn't the arrival of a perfect self. It's the arrival of a self with more room to move. Consider a father who grew up watching his own father discipline through fear, raised voices, sudden, unpredictable anger, a household where children learned to read a room before they learned to read a book. He swore, the way most people in this position swear, that he would never make his own children feel that particular flavor of small. And for years, despite that intention, he found the same voice rising in him during moments of stress, the same posture, the same words even, arriving on his tongue before he could stop them. What changed wasn't the arrival of the impulse. The impulse, it turns out, doesn't fully disappear just because you understand where it came from. What changed was the half-second of space that opened up between the impulse and the action, a space that widened slowly, through practice, until eventually he could feel the old rage rising and choose, deliberately, to lower his voice instead of raising it. That half-second is worth naming specifically, because it's often the entire difference between repeating a cycle and breaking one. Jung didn't believe the goal of psychological work was to eliminate difficult impulses entirely. He considered that both impossible and, in a strange way, undesirable, since the shadow contains not only destructive energy, but vitality, assertiveness, appetite, all the raw material a person needs to actually live a full life. The goal was to develop enough consciousness that the impulse no longer automatically became the action. Between stimulus and response, a gap opens, and inside that gap is the entire territory of freedom. This is also where people doing this work start to notice something unexpected. The same intensity that once expressed itself as rage or control or collapse doesn't vanish once it's no longer running the show unconsciously. It transforms into something usable. The controlling impulse becomes, once examined, a genuine gift for organization and protection, deployed consciously rather than compulsively. The tendency toward collapse becomes, once understood, a deep capacity for empathy, because you know intimately what it feels like to be overwhelmed. Nothing about you needs to be discarded entirely in this process. Almost everything gets repurposed, once it's no longer operating in the dark. I want to be honest about the cost of this transformation too, because I think honesty is the only version of this that actually helps. Some relationships won't survive your becoming whole. Some people in your life were only ever comfortable with the version of you that made yourself smaller for their benefit. And when that version stops showing up, they leave, or you find yourself needing to leave them. This is one of the harder truths Jung's work points toward, even if he never phrased it in these exact terms. Individuation is not a socially neutral act. It changes your relationships, sometimes permanently, because it changes the terms other people were used to negotiating with. There's also a strange kind of vertigo that comes with this stage, a disorientation that's rarely discussed. When you stop reacting from the old pattern, you sometimes don't know what to replace it with. The peacekeeper who stops smoothing things over doesn't automatically know how to sit in tension comfortably. She just knows she's not going to perform false calm anymore, and the space in between those two states can feel unbearably exposed. This is normal. This is, in fact, exactly what growth looks like from the inside before it settles into something that feels natural. Somewhere in this stage, people often start noticing something unexpected. A strange kind of grief for the family that could have been, rather than only grief for what actually happened. You start imagining the version of your childhood where the pattern had already been broken before it ever reached you. The parent who got the help they needed. The grandparent who never had to build that armor in the first place. That imagined loss is real grief, even though it's grief for something that never existed. Jung understood mourning like this too. He knew that healing sometimes required grieving not only your actual history, but the alternate history you never got to have. This is usually where the fear shows up loudest, not fear of the past, but fear of the future you're now responsible for building without a template. If the pattern gets broken with you, what replaces it? If you don't know how to parent the way you were parented, and you refuse to parent the way you were parented, what's actually left? This fear is common enough that it's almost a universal marker of this stage, and it's worth naming directly. You are allowed to feel completely unequipped for the thing you're already doing. Competence in uncharted territory develops slowly, through doing, not through certainty arriving first. There's a specific kind of fear that arrives here too, quieter than the grief, but persistent in its own way. The fear that you'll do all of this work, break the pattern in yourself, and still somehow pass something down anyway, some remnant you didn't even know you were still carrying. This fear rarely goes away entirely, and there's an argument that it shouldn't, because it's part of what keeps a person paying attention rather than assuming the work is finished and switching off their awareness. But it's worth distinguishing between a healthy, motivating version of this fear and a paralyzing one. The motivating version says, stay awake, keep looking, keep repairing when you get it wrong. The paralyzing version says you'll never really change, so why try? And that version deserves to be met with real skepticism rather than belief, because it's usually just the old pattern's last defense, trying to talk you out of the very thing that threatens it. Consider a woman raising her first child, terrified in the particular way new parents are terrified, watching herself for any sign of the coldness her own mother showed her. She catches herself, one evening, feeling a flash of that same coldness rise during a long night of a baby who won't stop crying, an exhaustion so total it briefly resembles the withdrawal she remembers from her own childhood. For a moment, she's convinced she's already failed, already become the thing she swore she'd never become. What she doesn't yet see in that raw moment is the difference between her mother's actual withdrawal and her own passing exhaustion. Her mother's coldness was a permanent, chosen distance. Hers is a single hard night, followed by the choice to pick her child up anyway, to keep showing up despite the flash of familiar feeling. The presence of an old reflex is not the same thing as the return of an old pattern. What matters is what you do in the moment after the reflex rises. What tends to help, more than anything else, is proof. Small, repeated proof that a different way is actually possible, not theoretical. A moment where you feel anger rising and, instead of the old reflex, you pause, breathe, choose something else, and the world doesn't end. A moment where your own child expresses a big feeling and you don't flinch away from it, don't punish it, simply sit with them inside it until it passes. These moments are small. They don't feel like triumph in the moment they happen, but they accumulate, and eventually they become evidence strong enough to override decades of inherited certainty that this was the only way things could go. There's a particular kind of power that starts to become available here, and it's different from the power the old pattern offered. The old pattern's power was reactive, control born from fear, dominance born from having once been dominated, silence born from having once been punished for speaking. The new power is something else entirely. It's the ability to respond rather than react, to choose your behavior instead of being driven by it, to hold a difficult feeling without immediately discharging it onto someone else. Jung believed this kind of power, psychological freedom essentially, was the actual goal of individuation, more valuable than any external form of success. This is also, I think, the right moment to mention something that fits naturally here, at the edge of this shift into something more solid. A lot of what makes this stage survivable is structure. Not rigid rules, but something to lean on while you're building new instincts from scratch. That's the entire premise behind True Self-Discovery, the guide connected to this channel. It isn't a quick fix because there isn't one, and anyone promising you one is selling something other than the truth. What it offers instead is 24 exercises built from Jung's own methods of self-inquiry, meant to help you find your way within during exactly this disorienting middle stretch, the part where the old self has died and the new one hasn't fully arrived yet. If you felt that particular kind of vertigo while listening to this, it's there, linked below, whenever you're ready for it. Now let's talk about what actually waits for you on the other side of all this. What waits isn't a finished, permanently healed person, and I want to be careful not to promise you that, because it would be a lie, and lies don't actually serve anyone doing this kind of work. What waits is someone who has more choice than they used to have. Someone who still gets triggered sometimes, still catches an old reflex rising, but now has the awareness to notice it before it drives the car. That noticing is the whole difference. It's the line between repeating a pattern unconsciously and choosing, consciously, whether to let it move through you or not. Jung talked about this using a phrase that has stayed relevant across the decades since he wrote it. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. That word, fate, is worth sitting with for a moment. It's what a lot of us called our family patterns before we understood them. This is just how things are. This is just how I am. This is just what happens in families like mine. Fate is a comfortable word because it removes responsibility. It also removes power. The moment you understand a pattern well enough to see its architecture, it stops being fate and starts being a choice, even if it's a hard one, even if you don't always choose well. This is what it actually means to be a cycle breaker. It doesn't mean perfection or having transcended your history entirely. It means you can see the pattern clearly enough now that you get to decide in each moment whether to hand it forward or set it down. Some days you'll set it down cleanly. Some days you'll catch yourself halfway through handing it forward and manage to stop. Some days, if you're honest, you'll hand it forward anyway, and the work then becomes repairing rather than pretending it didn't happen. All of that is still the work. None of it disqualifies you from having done real, significant transformation. There's something important here about the relationship between healing and perfection that deserves to be said plainly, because so much of the content around this subject implies otherwise. Breaking a cycle doesn't mean you never repeat any part of it again. It means the repetitions get smaller, rarer, more quickly recognized and repaired. It means your children, or the people who depend on you, inherit a fraction of what you inherited instead of the whole weight of it, and that fraction keeps shrinking the longer you stay conscious. Jung's own life reflected this. He wasn't a perfectly integrated person by the end of his life. He struggled, he had blind spots, he made mistakes in his relationships that he wrote about with more honesty than most people manage. What made him different wasn't flawlessness. It was his refusal to stop looking. Repair, it turns out, matters more than perfection ever could. And this is one of the more freeing realizations available in this work. A parent who loses their temper and then comes back an hour later, kneels down and says clearly, "I was wrong to raise my voice like that. That wasn't about you." is teaching their child something profoundly different from what silence would teach. They're teaching that mistakes don't have to be hidden to be survivable. They're teaching that a relationship can hold rupture and return to safety afterward, which is, in the end, one of the most protective lessons a child can learn. More protective in some ways than never witnessing a parent's imperfection at all. This reframes the entire project in a way that tends to relieve an enormous amount of pressure. You are not required to become a person who never repeats any fragment of the old pattern. You are required to become a person who notices when you have, and who repairs it rather than pretending it didn't happen, which was very likely the exact thing that never happened in the household that shaped you. The absence of repair, more than the presence of conflict itself, is often what made a childhood feel unsafe. Its presence, modeled consistently, can undo a remarkable amount of what silence once caused. There's a particular grief that surfaces around this realization too. Grief for the repair you never got, the apology that never came, the acknowledgement you waited for as a child and are, on some level, still waiting for as an adult. That grief deserves space of its own. You may never receive it from the people who owed it to you. Learning to offer it to others, and eventually to offer a version of it to yourself, is part of what allows the waiting to finally end. That refusal to stop looking is, I think, the actual definition of a cycle breaker, more than any single achievement or breakthrough. Less a title you earn once and keep forever. It's really a daily practice of staying awake to your own patterns, staying willing to see what's uncomfortable, staying committed to responding differently, even when the old reflex would be so much easier. Some days that practice looks heroic. Most days it looks like small, unglamorous choices nobody else will ever witness or thank you for. I think about the people who will never know they benefited from your work. The child you haven't had yet, who will grow up without the particular fear you grew up with, without ever understanding what it cost you to make that true. The partner who gets to receive your presence instead of your defenses, who has no idea how much unlearning it took to be able to offer that. Even people outside your immediate family. A friend who finally feels safe enough to be honest with you because you stopped performing the old dynamics that used to make honesty dangerous. This is the quiet, invisible legacy of cycle breaking. Almost none of it gets witnessed. All of it matters anyway. There's a kind of loneliness in that too, worth naming honestly rather than glossing over with false comfort. You may never get thanked for this. The family members who benefit most from your work, future generations who simply won't inherit what you did, will likely never know what you spared them from, because the whole point is that they won't have to carry it in the first place. That's not a tragedy. It's the actual shape of the gift. But it can feel strange to do this much work in service of people who will never fully understand its cost, including people who don't exist yet. What helps, more than recognition ever could, is connection with others walking a similar road. People who understand without lengthy explanation what it means to sit at a family table feeling like a stranger, what it means to grieve a childhood you're still technically inside of, what it means to build an entire adult identity from scratch because the one you were handed doesn't fit anymore. You are not as alone in this as the isolation sometimes makes you feel. There are more people doing this work quietly, in their own families, than the silence around the subject would ever suggest. There's also something worth saying about time, because cycle breaking gets sold sometimes as though it happens on a schedule, a few months of therapy, a handful of hard conversations, and then arrival. That isn't how it actually goes for almost anyone. It happens in seasons. There are stretches where you feel entirely free of the old pattern, months where the new way of being feels natural, unforced, like it was always who you were underneath. And then something happens. A loss, a stressor, a return to the family house for a holiday, and the old pattern reappears, sometimes with startling force, and it can feel like everything you built has collapsed overnight. It hasn't collapsed. This is simply what integration actually looks like from the inside, as opposed to how it looks from a distance. Jung understood psychological growth as something closer to a spiral than a straight line. You return, again and again, to similar territory, but each time you return to it with more awareness than the last, so that even the relapses carry information the earlier version of you didn't have access to. The goal was never to reach a point where the old pattern never surfaces again. The goal was to reach a point where, when it surfaces, you recognize it faster, hold it more gently, and return to yourself sooner than you did the time before. This matters because a lot of people give up on this work exactly at the point where an old reaction resurfaces after months of feeling free of it, interpreting the relapse as proof that none of the growth was real. It was real. Growth was never supposed to mean immunity. It was supposed to mean a shorter distance between losing yourself and finding your way back. A distance that keeps shrinking the longer you stay in relationship with your own patterns instead of pretending, once again, that they've been permanently defeated. Jung believed something about individuation that feels especially relevant here, that the process, while intensely personal, was never meant to happen in total isolation. He worked with patients precisely because he understood that some parts of the unconscious only reveal themselves in relationship, in being witnessed, in being reflected back to by someone who can see what you can't yet see in yourself. This is part of why healing work resists being purely solitary. You need mirrors along the way, whether that's a therapist, a friend who's further down this road, or a structured practice that gives your inner life somewhere concrete to land. There's one more thing worth naming before we get to the close. Something about the difference between the family you were born into and the family or community you build for yourself as an adult. Cycle breaking doesn't only mean setting down what was handed to you. It also means, eventually, choosing what you carry forward instead, deliberately, with open eyes, rather than by default. This is where a lot of hope actually lives in this work, more than in the grief or the reckoning that comes earlier. You get to decide what gets kept. The tenderness your grandmother had underneath all that armor, the humor your father used to survive things he never talked about, the resilience that runs through your family alongside everything harder. None of that has to be discarded just because it arrived tangled up with pain. Part of individuation is sorting the inheritance carefully, keeping what serves you, setting down what doesn't, rather than either accepting the whole weight of it or rejecting all of it out of understandable anger. If you've made it this far, I want you to know something plainly, without softening it into something smaller than it is. What you're doing, questioning the pattern, refusing to hand it forward unexamined, sitting with the discomfort of being the first, is genuinely hard, in ways that people who haven't done it rarely understand or credit. It is also genuinely worth it, not because the difficulty disappears, but because the difficulty starts to serve something instead of just repeating itself endlessly with no direction. You didn't choose to be born into the family you were born into, with whatever it was carrying long before you arrived. You didn't choose the specific shape of the pattern, the particular flavor of silence or rage or fear that got handed to you before you had any language to resist it. But you are choosing, right now, in this moment, whether to keep carrying it forward unexamined or to finally set some of it down. That choice, repeated daily, in small, unremarkable moments nobody else will ever see, is the entire substance of what it means to break a cycle. Jung wrote about a figure he called the wounded healer, borrowing from an old mythological image of a healer whose own wound becomes the source of their capacity to help others. He didn't mean this romantically, as though suffering automatically qualifies someone to guide others through it. He meant something more precise, that a wound genuinely faced, examined, and integrated becomes a form of knowledge unavailable to people who haven't been through it, and that this knowledge, once earned, has real value, not despite the wound, but because of what the facing of it required. This is, in a strange way, the deepest reframe available to anyone doing this work. The pattern you inherited was never a gift, and there's no need to pretend otherwise in service of some tidy narrative about everything happening for a reason. But your response to that pattern, the fact that you turned toward it instead of away, that you did the harder thing instead of the easier one, that response is something you get to claim as genuinely yours. Nobody handed you that. You built it, in the dark, mostly alone, out of material nobody would have chosen if given the option. That's what makes cycle breaking different from simply having a difficult past. Plenty of people carry difficult pasts without ever examining them, and the pattern moves through them into the next generation unchanged, the same as water follows the path already worn into stone. What makes you different isn't the wound, it's the decision, made and remade daily, to meet the wound directly instead of letting it drive from somewhere out of sight. That decision is available to you regardless of how far along this road you currently are, whether you're standing at the very beginning of it or years into the slow, unglamorous work of living it out. There's a version of this work that stays private, entirely internal, worked through alone in the quiet hours when old patterns surface and need to be met with something other than the old reflex. And there's a version that benefits from structure, from a guide built specifically to help you ask the right questions in the right order, rather than reinventing the process from nothing. If you're standing at the edge of this, unsure how to begin turning insight into practice, that's exactly what true self-discovery was built for. 24 exercises drawn from Jung's own approach to the inner life, meant to help you find your way within, one honest question at a time. It's linked below whenever you're ready to walk through it.